righteousness and grace. First, I'd like to just make a quick little comment about genealogy. Notice that Abraham gave his ancestry abbreviated, but he gave his ancestry. In the reading from the scripture itself, it's a longer version. Genealogy was incredibly important in the Old Testament. It placed you. It decided who you were. You could give this whole ancestry that came before you. They were like soldiers behind your back. Let's say a young Jewish couple wants to relocate to a different town. They appear before the elders of that town and the leaders of the synagogue, and the first thing that the husband does is to give his genealogy. And one of the elders says, "Oh yeah, I knew your father. He's a good man." And an older member of the elders says, "I remember your grandfather. I served in such and such a war with him." The genealogy established who you were. And throughout the Old Testament, we see this genealogy. In fact, some books in the Old Testament are nothing but genealogy. And so begat so-and-so, who begat so-and-so. It seems boring to us. The names themselves are not that important. It's what's on one end and what's on the other that's important, because the genealogy establishes the connection. And it's not just Old Testament. The first book of the New Testament, Matthew, genealogy of Jesus Christ, tracing him back for 42 generations, connecting him to Abraham. 42 generations. So genealogy is important, and even today it is. We in the more mainstream Christian churches refer to genealogy as the communion of saints. We're connecting ourselves with the people from way back who lived good lives and stand as examples for us. The Mormons know this. If you've done anything with modern genealogy, you know that sooner or later you're going to get referred back to Salt Lake City, because the Mormons are strong believers in this idea of the continuity of the faith. So I just wanted to bring that up. It does feed in a bit into what's happening. So we have Abraham, towering figure in the Old Testament, right up there with Moses. God promises him, and we see the promise works out. He becomes the father of nations. Paul picks up on that, refers back to Abraham, and this continuity right on through, as he talks to the people of Rome in his letter to the Romans. There was a debate going on. This is behind the scenes, although I think it's in a few previous verses to Romans. There was a huge debate going on, a theological debate. So serious that they actually had a meeting, not what we would actually call a council today, but they had a meeting in Jerusalem. Most of the apostles attended, Paul attended. The core of the matter was, if you want to become a Christian today, then, do you first have to become a Jew? For the men, did you have to undergo circumcision? Because that was obviously the sign, the physical sign of being a Jew. Most of the apostles, including Peter, said, "Oh yes." Paul said no. And Paul, although he was the newest of the apostles, not really one of the original 12, Paul prevailed. You could become a Christian directly without having to go through the old traditional Jewish laws and rites and regulations. So this was a really big debate. Now we get to the core of what the readings itself is about and what my talk is about. Grace versus righteousness. In the Old Testament, you hardly ever hear grace mentioned. It was kind of a foreign idea to the mentality of the Jewish people. The term that you more often hear is righteousness. This person was righteous. He walked with the Lord. But what that really translates to is grace. Grace is a very mysterious thing, and it's almost like a little dance. I don't know how many of you realize it, but there's actually a dictionary in the back of these Bibles, these pew Bibles. And when you look at what it talks about for New Testament, for a definition of grace, it's the idea of a gift from God, totally unmerited. We don't deserve it. but God chooses to give it to us through his Son, Jesus Christ. Totally unmerited. That's why Paul, in his kind of confusing terminology, as he kind of rolls his sentences around back and forth, is saying that if Abraham had deserved to be righteous and deserved the things that God set out for him to be able to do, he probably wouldn't have made it. In fact, he surely wouldn't have. But with God's grace, as a righteous man, it all worked out. Grace versus righteousness. Now, when we get to the New Testament, Paul loved the term. He hardly ever used righteous. He used grace all the time. Because he realized that through Jesus Christ, wonderful things could happen to us. But grace is kind of elusive. We can set ourselves up to be open to it, but it's not our choice. The Catholic Church, unfortunately, and I know this because I was involved in it a great deal, the Catholic Church places an awful lot of emphasis on good works. And back in the 14th and 15th centuries, that was one of the really big divisive things between Protestantism and Catholicism. Because Protestantism realized that there was this need for grace that you couldn't earn in any way. God gave it freely. You couldn't earn it. So this is one of the things that Paul is bringing up here. As we get into Jesus and Nicodemus, and you remember a few weeks ago I stood here and we talked about the disciples and we talked about the Pharisees and how the Pharisees were stuck on this idea of the letter of the law versus the spirit, and how Jesus was all over them. You brood of vipers, you hypocrites. He doesn't do this to Nicodemus. Even though Nicodemus sneaks in under the cover of darkness, because he's afraid of what his colleagues would say, Nicodemus obviously is onto something. He's open to at least some grace. Master, you couldn't do these things unless you came from God. But Nicodemus is trained as a Pharisee. He probably comes from a generational line of Pharisees, because it was hereditary. He cannot shake the idea that the letter is more important than the spirit. He doesn't get into the fact that Jesus did some of his cures on the Sabbath, which of course was a no-no to the Pharisees. But he does, he's seeking, he's curious, he's searching for this. How come? How can you do this? He doesn't come out and say, "Are you the Messiah?" But he's trying to figure out in his own mind and with his own background what Jesus is all about. Jesus does come back at him kind of not angrily, but he does say, look, I'm giving you some physical examples of things. The wind he talks about. You know, you can see it, you can hear it, you can't see it, but you can hear it, you feel it. But if you don't understand that physical thing that happens around us, how on earth are you going to understand about heaven? There's only one person that can tell you about heaven. And the reason that he can tell you that is because he's been there. He's ascended and come back down again, and now he's telling you what it's all about. That's where things are. That's why this idea of a new order has happened. I haven't come to destroy the old law. I've come to improve on it. I've come to help you understand it better. I've come to help you see the spirit of the law rather than the letter. Again, a few weeks ago when I was here before you, I made mention of this idea of people lifting a single phrase out of the Bible and making a great deal out of it. 2 days later, I was browsing online and I came across the thing to the effect that a pastor in one of the Kentucky snake handler churches had been bitten and died. Immediately after his service, the members of the congregation handled snakes again. It seems to me that what is happening in those little churches, they're illegal, by the way, as far as the law of the land goes, they're illegal. It seems what is happening is These people are putting themselves in a position where they're in danger, and then they're saying, you know, God, help me. Cover me on this. You said they shall handle serpents without harm. And they're basing a whole bunch of their belief on that one phrase. Now, you've got to give them credit. One of their members has been bitten and died, and yet they're back at it again. But I think this is a wrong approach. And again, let's go to see what Jesus says about this. Jesus is out in the desert. 40 days fasting. Our Lent. It's the predecessor to our Lent. And he's hungry and he's kind of dazed and all. And the devil comes along. And he tempts him in a number of ways. And one of the temptations he does is he spirits Jesus up to the top of the spires of the temple in Jerusalem. Many, many stories up there. And he looks at Jesus and he says, okay, you're the Son of God. Cast yourself down. You don't have to worry. God will send angels to bear you up before you hit the ground. He's setting Jesus up for something where God would have to save him. And what does Jesus say? Begone, Satan. It is written, you shall not tempt the Lord your God. Seems to me that's what some of our snake handling friends are doing. So this grace, Lent can be a time to help us set up for accepting grace, at least some grace, so that once we receive that, it kind of opens our minds to more possibilities and opens us up to more possibilities of letting the Spirit in. So the fasting, a lot of people fast during Lent, or at least cut back on things, offer certain foods they stop eating that they like and all. The medieval monks believed very strongly that a certain amount of fasting sharpened your mind. It didn't dull you as you would think. You're not starving. That's not what I'm saying. You don't starve yourself. But by cutting back a little bit, you sharpen your senses. You open yourself more to the possibilities of the spiritual. And that is one of the aspects of why fasting has become commonplace and more or less popular during Lent. So grace is this, as I said, kind of a dance. You set yourself up for it. You realize there's no expectations. It's not going to necessarily happen. You know, it's up to God. It's up to Jesus. But you set yourself up for it. You open yourself up as much as you can. And if God chooses to give you that grace, and he very often does, because he welcomes a person who is open, spiritually open. So he gives us some grace. And we say, wow, yeah, I never saw that before. I didn't think of that before. And now, again, there's an opportunity to open yourself up again and have more grace come in. This is what it's all about. And as I said, it's kind of a little dance-like between a person and God. So this is what I got out of these combinations of the three readings. Nicodemus trying so hard to understand, Jesus encouraging him, that at one point, Yiddish hadn't been invented yet at this point, of course. It came much later. But in the line where Jesus says, Nicodemus, you're a ruler, you're a teacher of Israel, and you don't understand these things, I can picture Jesus going, Oy vey, what's the matter with you, Nicodemus? I could just picture him doing that. So, I think that pretty much covers everything that I wanted to get to. Tying together, again, the idea of the genealogy in the Old Testament. You've got your backing behind you of all these people that have come before you. In the modern church, the idea of this communion of saints, these examples of all these people that have come behind us, they're standing there behind us as an army, an invisible army. Their lives can be examples of looking at grace. They did things, not the actions themselves that merited it, but their opening of themselves to God. You know, we very often hear about the saints as being dreary and sad and morose people that put themselves off in a corner somewhere. The saints were happy people. They were out amongst people. Some of them chose instead to stay as prayer warriors inside convents and inside the monasteries. But they were happy people. They were happy in Christ. And we can do the same. You know, there's one Bible passage where it says, you shouldn't know if you're doing penance. You shouldn't have a long face. You shouldn't be wearing sackcloth and ashes. You should go about your business normally. Other people should not look at you and say, oh, wow, that person is fasting. That person must be very holy. They're doing all these things that were prescribed in the Old Testament. No, we should have a happy face, and yet we should continue on as if everything is normal. Yet within ourselves, we've opened ourselves to God. And I think that is about all we need to say. Thank you.
15 minutes, Bob.
So Bernie suggested.